Hi, it's me, Suskin. It's episode 3 of rodTV. So, first, once again, thanks for your great support and comments and everything. Don't forget to share the link with your friends and to encourage your friends to subscribe to the YouTube channel. It's free, just search for my name there or go to my website. You can also subscribe from there. So, last couple of weeks, we've been talking about predictions for the world and predictions for you personally under the kind of notion of sun and planets. Clearly, prediction is part of the job of astrologers and has always been. And one of the things that we don't really discuss is the extent to which astrology expects the predictions to come out fatalistically, everything just as so. It's one of the issues, the whole idea of making prediction raises. So I firstly want to separate out predictions for South Africa or anything to do with the world. Those techniques in astrology are a school unto themselves and essentially are different with different rules than what we use for people and probably have different degrees of accuracy or meanings of that. But with a human being, we do expect when you go to an astrologer that the information that you're going to get is accurate and that the predictions that the astrologer makes are mostly accurate, in fact, very mostly accurate. So the question is, why do we get predictions? What does it mean that astrologers can make predictions? What does it mean that I've been making these predictions over the last couple of weeks? And what does it really mean? Is astrology saying that everything is fated? Can we actually change the future? Do we go to the astrologer to find out how to change the future because of what would happen? And that raises all sorts of philosophical questions about what happens if you know what's going to happen in the future and then you try and change it, and then is the prediction true or is the prediction now false? We don't have to go there. What we really need to ask is, what is astrology's model of fate, or if you like, of the future, or if you like, of karma? Astrology as we know it mostly develops into this form in the last few hundred years BC, after being developed by the Babylonians for at least 1,000 years. And around that time, the philosophical ideas that were important in the world that we read in the Indian, Greek, and other scholars of the time, and they were important in astrology. They informed astrology, which was very fundamental to the worldview. Not that everyone thought of it as astrology, but what astrology expressed was how people understood the cosmos to work, and that it was in one way all connected, but that in another way, by its behavior, it revealed itself. And so that we still think of to this very day when we try and understand physical models by looking at nature and the world, etc. So, given that at the time that astrology develops, what we think of as Indian philosophies are strongly influential, for the most part, the worldview that astrology plugged into was the worldview that we understand, that of karma. And when we know that, and when we have a look at the tools that astrologers developed, we can see that in a pretty straightforward manner, astrology attempts to follow a pretty straightforward concept that seems important to many of those who might have practiced astrology. And that worldview was essentially that, to simplify, karma can be simplified to three strengths. Fate can be simplified to three strengths. Simply put, then, there are those things that cannot be changed. There are those things that can be changed with difficulty, and there are those things that can be changed with ease. So there are kind of three types of fate and three types of karma. It's probably really a sliding spectrum, but there are three basic concepts that work like that. And astrology is a model that tries to assess, in every case of everything that a chart might talk about, which category does that fall into? Is it unchangeable, changeable with difficulty, or changeable with ease. And that is essentially the worldview around which astrology operates, and actually, for itself, has a reasonably clear construct of what it is trying to say by making a prediction. Essentially, it's trying to say the same thing that sometimes a weather forecaster or other kind of forecaster might say, and that is that there is a certain probability of something. So it's a greater or lesser probability, and it's a probability estimate. So that estimate, based on the best knowledge of both what is known by that meteorologist and the past record from that meteorologist, will allow them to say what the weather is going to be. And astrology is trying to do the same thing. It is using the past record in the sense of the knowledge of astrology accumulated over a long time, and is also using the tools of astrology, which give astrologers the way to assess what is the likelihood of something. Mostly, when an astrologer talks about predictions, they concentrate on those things that are more likely than others. Also, to give a sense to our client of what the probability of anything really is. We do mention the lesser probabilities, but say that there are lesser probabilities. So that is the rounded view that astrology has. It doesn't have this black and white idea that says things are either fated or they aren't. And it's really a lot more complicated than that, but it's not complicated in a difficult way to understand. It's just that there's factors that are on a sliding scale, and astrology is a tool devised by human beings that can only represent those probabilities to a certain extent, to a great extent, but not to a full extent. So then, the astrologer's job is to try and weigh up the factors that tell him or her whether something is very likely, somewhat likely, or not likely at all, and to answer questions for a person using likelihoods, so that especially if a person wants to do something, because you can say, well, it has got a chance of succeeding, not a huge amount, which is different than saying it has no chance of succeeding or definitely go ahead. So we have the scale, concentrate on the top of the scale, but can generally look for other things. And as I was saying a moment ago, it is a human developed tool that will have certain limitations because of that. But again, in developing of the tool, astrology has eventually tried to stick with certain constants that hold true to what astrology is about and what has worked for a long time. Astrology has grown and changed like anything has, but under really dubious circumstances. A lot of how astrology developed in the last few hundred years was actually in a state of having been disconnected from knowledge of how astrology had been practiced in the thousands of years of its heyday. So we now, in the 21st century, live in an era where astrology is tending to become more complete and is reconnected with its roots. Mostly, when I'm talking about astrology in these shows, I'm really talking about my way of the traditional practice of astrology, as best as possible, as I've been taught, as how it was practiced and has been practiced since the last 2,000 years in its more intact form. And that will deal with one of the questions we have for later on. But before I get to one of those questions, I just want to take this idea then of, okay, so some things are changeable and some things aren't, and astrology can guide us as to which are and which aren't, which makes it incredibly useful. But at the same time, what about actually affecting the future? And well, of course, the end result of knowing what is changeable and what isn't changeable is to give you a greater opportunity to act with free will. It doesn't mean that your action is as free as you think or that it might be as powerful as you think. But you've got that force that you can work with that will more or less influence the situation. What do I mean by saying your will isn't as free as you think? Well, of course, your personality affects it, your habits and addictions affect it, your past experience affects it. So it's not as free as you'd think, but the more conscious we become, hopefully, the freer that becomes. And it only affects it to a certain extent because that depends on how changeable the thing actually is. We don't easily step out of our own comfort zones or kind of be different to our personality or what has come naturally to us for so long. So we don't easily change things. Maybe that's what makes them hard to change. And astrology certainly looks at it that way too. But in the end, by knowing what is going on, we've got the best opportunity to act as consciously as possible and to affect the outcome as much as possible. And so we might not be able to change a fact. We might be addicted to something and not be able to change that. But we are able to change the behavior of whether we succumb to that addiction every day, whether it's drinking, smoking, or anything else. You can choose to not go down that road, even though you can not necessarily change your personality that says, I'm addictive that way. And so free will is a powerful thing. It doesn't necessarily change the underlying karma. You're still that addict, but gives you the power to change the outcomes and change your life without having changed one iota of genes or karma in that process. So it's got the space to work with that. And again, astrology's job is to try and see the when and hows, but to take it one step further in a process of actually choosing when to do something. And that's where we can actually, having gained the information from astrology that says these are the likelihoods of something going on, and this is likely when it's going on, because these are based on past knowledge of these intricate cycles. So we can then say, okay, what action can I take? Beyond the issue of free will, which I just spoke about, is the issue of timing. And astrology's other great role is saying when to do something. It's a little bit like in nature, it seems as if all the other creatures know just when to do something. And maybe there are chemicals or reactions that make a plant or an animal know exactly how many minutes of daylight are on that day. But a human being doesn't seem to have that faculty or much like it. We have a bit of that, but it's not much like it at all. But astrology encompasses amongst other things that it does, it encompasses our experience of time as human beings, and it encompasses and passes down the richness of that knowledge from things big like 7-year cycles and seasons, which that knowledge is passed on in astrology, to intricate little cycles that affect us individually because of the accumulation of this knowledge. So then that gives us the option of saying there is a best time to do something. And so astrologers often have the job of saying when is the best time to do something. And a good number of our clients come to us for exactly that reason. When to have an operation, or when to buy or sell something, or those kind of, if you like, attempts to gain the greatest advantage from the time that you're in. How much does that change the outcome? Depends on what came first, and that is the karma, fate, strength of whatever is happening to the person involved in that situation. That is actually going to come first. So if you say, when is the best time for me to start a business? And the astrologer looks at your own chart and says, this is a great time. So then we'll look at the actual best time using a special chart for choosing a time. But if your chart says this is a terrible time for starting a business, the choosing the right time is only going to have a limited effect. But nevertheless, it's better than doing nothing. So the situation will sometimes guide the extent to which you can make a difference. But bottom line is, you can make a difference, because ultimately, even if you're not fundamentally changing fate any more than you can fundamentally change your genes, you can do things about your genetic outcomes just as much as you can do things about your astrological outcomes, to a greater or lesser extent. Some genetic outcomes say have a good lifestyle and it'll be fine. Some say have an operation, which is a bit radical, and it'll be fine. And some say there's nothing you can do. So it's the same kind of idea that says with everything, the point is not to try and change what is the meaning of the fate. The gene itself doesn't change, the chart itself doesn't change, but is to change your response, which is where your consciousness lies. And so the purpose of astrology is to help us try and be as conscious as possible, as often as possible. And its method of doing that is to align us exactly to time and space as much as we can, because since time immemorial, we've always known there lies the secret of everything. That time and space are the two ingredients that make this third dimension. That physicists and metaphysicists both tell us that beyond the three dimensions, time and space are not relevant. They are parts of each other and part of the third dimension. So beyond this, there isn't time and space, and physics can even say so, but none of us can get our heads around that because we're in time and space. And the art of astrology is saying, since we are, here's what you need to know about time and space to try and get the best possible outcome and the best possible consciousness out of it. That is the meaning of astrology. Tool for living. So then, on the topic of what astrology is really all about, let's have a little Astrology 101. So, two quick things on Astrology 101 today. One of them is a question by Deborah, who asks that since astrology can talk about children, can it talk about grandchildren? Deborah, the answer is yes, it can. It can talk about anyone in your family to any level, even those that are not related to you by blood. But the way it talks about anyone beyond your nuclear immediate relatives is through asking a question, not deriving information. So, for example, I could look at your chart and say there will be a development in your child's life. I can't look at your chart and say there'll be a development in your grandchild's life, even though there's a house for grandchildren, because the house for grandchildren, that's only one of its very secondary meanings, and it's probably talking about something else, not grandchildren. Whereas if you say to me, will this happen with my grandchild, I'd know where to look to find the answer, because there is a house for grandchildren. But it's kind of passive. The stuff that's not immediate in our lives is passive. So the other Astrology 101 I want to mention is a little bit more fundamental, and that's a question from Helen. One astronomer has suggested, or one little small team of astronomers has suggested, that there might be an extremely distant, very huge planet with an orbit of 22,000 years around the Sun. And Helen asks, what would be the relevance of that to astrology? And since it has a 22,000 year orbit, would its position at the time of your birth be relevant at all? And it's a great question, because it really deals with the issue of all these things that are in the sky, and that astronomers keep on juggling with what is a planet and where is a planet, and you know, changing the definition of a planet, which is how poor old Pluto got demoted from being planet, and how various asteroids have suddenly found themselves as planets, and how now that they look in another definition of what a planet is, they can find objects in the Kuiper Belt, which is where this other object might exist. So first, if there were a planet that had a 22,000 year orbit around the Sun, its position at any of our births would not be different by its position in the zodiac. But in our individual charts, it would be a little bit different. You'll remember last week I spoke about how the time and place of birth affect where things are seen in the sky. And so even in the case of Planet 9 or Planet X, it would still affect that. It might sit in one sign of the zodiac for thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years. But for different peeps, it'll be in different houses. So there would always be something to say about it. But the question would be, what would you say? And so this is what happens in modern times, and this is really even since the 19th, maybe the 18th century. I think it's the 19th century. And that is that an astronomer discovers a planet, or someone discovers a planet, and it's reported to the astronomy dudes. And the planet gets named, usually some kind of mythological name or other. And then what modern astrologers in these couple of hundred years do is then devise a whole bunch of meanings for this object based on the arbitrary mythological name that was given to it by some arbitrary person, and maybe trusting in some kind of synchronicity or coincidence or something like that, to give it meaning. And that's probably not too wise a practice. To me, it sounds a little kind of superstitious and random. And astrology was actually devised by observation. The planet Mars, the warrior, was the planet was given the name Mars by the Romans very late in the day, after astrology's first heyday, because what they said about the planet suited with the idea of Mars, the Roman god. So the planets first gradually revealed their meaning by observation and stuff happening on the Earth. And then they began to get named and given characteristics because they behaved that way. People didn't make assumptions. Okay, let's just call that one the war god. They watched what it did, and every time it's over there, we have a fight with the neighbors. Eventually, they called it the war god, and then the Romans called it Mars, and so it really is the revealing of the planet, which for a 22,000 year long planet would take a very long time. And would it? Because which one of us can see Planet 9? So far, none of us. But even if it's discovered, even still, which one of us would, let alone see Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, which are invisible to our eyes and are generally considered planets by astrologers? So then, the real question is, what does astrology do with all these extra planets and objects that are in the sky? And the answer is that the original idea of planets is that they are visible, because the original idea of astrology is that it is light that is consciousness, that is the will of the the universe, the creator, whatever you want to think of it as, and that it's through light descending through the planets that we're able to use the planets. In other words, as they reflect the light to us, that we're able to use the planets to understand what is the cosmic vibe. So it's all about light and the visibility of light, which means that astrology would say of the discovery of invisible objects, well, interesting, but maybe it would say meh. Now, astrologers often do use Uranus, Neptune, Pluto because what we do know about these modern planets, the invisible ones, is that they don't represent personal things so much as big cycles of change. And those are the ones we use to make the big predictions. The invisible planets are used to make the big predictions. But there are lots of other predictive techniques in astrology that existed before those invisibles were. So then, Helen, the answer to your question is that since it's an invisible planet with a very slow orbit, should it exist, it's unlikely to have any personal relevance to anyone. And even if it did, we wouldn't know what it was, short of using random superstition to make it all up. So I think we shouldn't worry about that. We shouldn't worry about the various other millions of invisible things, planets and asteroids that are out there. Certainly, they keep on discovering planets in other galaxies or other solar systems. I mean, it's like, yay, nothing to do with astrology, though. What we can see is fundamentally the roots of astrology. There is plenty more technique on top of that, especially in modern times. There's plenty of mathematical technique, which is what we can't see in astrology. And there's plenty of use for what we can't see. But as a general rule, if we can't see it, to us it isn't a planet. Even solves the problem of Pluto. I did want to say something about what's happening in the sky right now because someone also asked me that question. There is apparently a lineup of planets going on. Yes, indeed, there is. What is a lineup and what does it mean is the real question. Well, if you rise before around about 4:30 to 5 in the morning, depending on where you are in the world, that's a little bit different. You will see the 5 visible planets plus the moon lined up in a straight line from the horizon upwards. Mercury is there too, planet you can't usually see. So here you can see, actually you need to look right over your head to be able to see the whole line. And here is the line I'm putting in for you of the path of the planets so that you can see how perfectly lined up these planets are. It's a rare opportunity, once in about 15 years right now, well, since the last one. And so if you're up that time of the day, it's a great thing to look at or get up for. This picture you're looking at is from Cape Town, but if you're in the northern hemisphere, it's going to look a little bit different. It's going in the other direction, as you can see. And depending on how far away you are from the equator is how much up overhead you have to look in order to see it. But there it is, lineup of planets. What does it mean? A beautiful sight. Astrology is not about visible lines up of planets like that. While there is a technique in astrology that can make use of that information for kind of other reasons, it's not really particularly relevant as astrology goes. So that leaves us with your questions. And your questions, firstly, I have a question from Lorraine who says She has a one brand, one store. She wants to expand. I'm saying, Lorraine, this is it. You've got to go ahead. It is going to need courage, partly because of your personality, but this is the time to rush out there and get it on. Your personality, I mean, you're a Pisces, so you might not be too courageous most of the time. But this is definitely the time to go ahead, act with courage. It's going to work for you. Robert has been working on a project for 3 years, has registered the trademark, and has run into huge, powerful companies who are trying to register opposition to that trademark. Wants to know, is there a possibility to win the David versus Goliath fight? Robert, your chart does show that you're in the right and they're in the wrong. It shows that you could be ready or up against a big fight right now. So to me, it means you're definitely willing and going that way, the way you're behaving at the moment, the way your path is going at the moment. But the chart looks like not the best time to be fighting such a fight. I do have to warn you, the chart shows they are unethical and immoral. They will behave so that they have the devil's luck for them right now, which is not a good thing. They seem to have a lot of resources available to them, and your own chart warns that any battle undertaken right now will last at least through 2018. So it's not advisable where possible. The other thing is that they will try and pull the wool over your eyes or deceive you in some way. So you need to know that it is a big fight. You are in the right, and hopefully in the long run, should it ever go to court, the court would see it that way. But it would take 3 years to get you there through 2018, no matter what you do, because your chart says your enemy is strong because they are unscrupulous and they've got a lot of resources to be unscrupulous with. So they don't care what you do, they're unscrupulous. So maybe look at another strategy, another way. Timing wise, you would want to choose a good time, but on the whole, this isn't the best time. Maybe wait a little while. So remember, you can send your questions to this email address, and you can visit this website where you can also post your questions, and you can subscribe to this YouTube channel if you haven't already. Remember, it's free. And of course, join me next week on YouTube at noon, where we will be discussing your purpose in life and what astrology can do to help you understand that. And also, of course, your questions, some Astrology 101, and whatever else is happening at the time. Don't forget to be there and share with your friends.